Good afternoon. We're going to begin this week, before I get into Parshat Vayera, with a bit of an aside regarding two commentators I often use, both of them women, Nechama Leibowitz and Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg, each of whom I have had the privilege of learning with through the years. Nechama Leibowitz, who lived from 1905 to 1997, was a noted Israeli biblical scholar and commentator who rekindled and widened the context of interest in Tanakh, in the study of Torah, just as people were so interested in the application of its narrative and its lessons to our lives. She was dedicated to the understanding of the Pshat of the Midrash, the actual meaning, often quoting Rashi and asking the question, Ma kasha Rashi? What is difficult for Rashi? Where's the problem in the text for Rashi? And then expanding that, as Nachmanides did himself, and using Ramban, as well as others, to fuel her own further thinking, always based in the text itself, while trying to get not just at Rashi's words, but the intent that informed them. Her brother, Yeshaya Leibowitz, was also known for his understanding of the depth of the text, neither settling for a surface or superficial reading. Both were always acutely aware of the world around us and how that world provides a backdrop in which we are to find the inner meanings of the actual text. Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg, born in 1944, is a Scottish contemporary Torah scholar and author. She also has a PhD in English literature, one of the most difficult degrees to acquire due to the depth of study into the words of what we read and looking underneath and behind them in a way that may seem bothersome or too dense or too difficult to many. She moved to Israel in 1969 and has lived there since. Aviva looks at the drush, the explanatory level of the text, always remaining true to the Pshat of the text as examined by Nechama, but taking a deeper dive into what we are not being told, and that which we can infer from its words and narrative. In our own Parshat Vayera, in which we read about the beginning of our well-known Pesach narrative, we note that the skill sets these two women bring to the telling of this narrative, which many would claim, and not incorrectly, come to us from male-dominant perspectives, is quite different. We will begin with Aviva, who looks carefully at the language, and then, as she herself often says, underneath and behind the words that we read, as we have discussed previously. And in doing so, we're going to look at a problem, a challenge that many of us often address, and that is free choice. How can we speak of free choice when we read Vayechazek et lev Paro, and God hardened Pharaoh's heart? When does Pharaoh lose free choice, and how? That's what we are looking at. Is it God's doing, or is it Pharaoh's doing? What Moshe does, is it his doing, or is it God's doing? What is free choice? What does God know? And what do we do? And when do we lose free choice? We have the plagues. We have Moshe. We have the Bnei Yisrael and Pharaoh. With all of the power and watching the continued and increasing destruction of his kingdom and all that he holds dear as indicative of his unparalleled power. For many of us, one of the most perplexing moral dilemmas in this parsha, in the Torah, is the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. Our traditional commentaries teach that though Pharaoh hardens his own heart at first, ultimately God is the one who causes his heart to be hardened. How else can we explain the trajectory of the events that will unfold? But in providing this justification, an additional problem presents. Namely, how could God have hardened Pharaoh's heart? How could God take away Pharaoh's free choice? Remember that free choice, bechira chafshit, is precisely the gift bestowed on all people by God, the creator of all, distinguishing the human being from all other created beings, and most important, to God. As articulated in our Gemara in Masachet Yoma, our ability to choose is precisely what we give to God. And in so using it properly, we bring God into our world. Rabbi Josh Fagelson suggests as follows. One answer, perhaps, comes through a teaching of the Sfat Emet about the story of Yosef and Potiphar's wife, which was taught to him by Rabbi Michael Belinsky. The Sfat Emet carefully reads the language of the story and concludes that God actually took away Yosef's free choice in that encounter, such that Yosef did not have to hesitate at the moment of temptation, a reading that is amplified by the shalshelet in the text, but rather fled from the scene. Though the Sfat Emet probably goes a bit further than me, this is Rabbi Fagelson speaking, I would argue that what he means for us is that there are moments when the choice before us is so clear that our will and that of God are perfectly aligned. There's no distance. In the case of Pharaoh, however, just the opposite is true. His heart has become so hardened that he can no longer make his own choices, and he continually chooses to do wrong. An addiction, if you will. At this point, I would ask that we think about addictions and addictive behavior. At first, one chooses to do X, to have a drink, to take a drug, to have whatever encounters. And then X overtakes one's ability to choose. We deal with that often in our modern world as a disease. Now, when we look at the language, the Hebrew phrase for the hardening of Pharaoh's heart stems from the root KBD, kaf bet daled, kaved, which means heavy or weighty. Kavod also means honor, the heavy or weighty honor or attention we give to someone. It connotes this notion of honor as well as heavy because of the weightedness of ceremony or station that conveys kavod, honor. Aviva Zornberg, in her book, Exodus, The Particulars of Rapture, writes as follows. Pharaoh is the king of heaviness, whose heart continually grows heavier, and who therefore becomes even more oppressive, even as he is punished. He simply cannot stop his heart. Think of, for example, the gambler. The gambler is gambling money, may win, but doesn't walk away because they become addicted to the act of gambling and will lose and lose and lose and lose and continue to do so either way it goes. There are three words that are used in this narrative to indicate this heaviness or this choice making. Kavod, kaved, chazak, to be strong, and kasheh, to be hard. Affirming that Pharaoh reflected an imperviousness to the use of his choice for any other purpose than to continue his own path of power and destruction. Forge ahead, regardless of what you see. There's no empathy, no self-reflection, nothing to stop him. He becomes addicted to the process of his own perceived power. Zornberg teaches us that this is not about his listening to his inner consciousness, the seat of our free choice, that might cause him to reconsider and realize the impact of his actions. Rather, says Zornberg, he becomes as if he is unconscious and ultimately desires to remain in that state. Think of the expression, drunk with power. He is a self-contained body with no empathy or understanding or connectedness in his mind to social structures. In Zornberg's words, Pharaoh becomes fixated in unconsciousness, the downward drag of its specific gravity, which cannot be equated with a desire or choice to remain unconscious. Rather, it becomes his natural state. It takes over him. This is indeed the language of addiction. In Zornberg's explanation of the psychology of this stasis in her book, The Particulars of Rapture, Reflections on Exodus, she quotes Sartre in his evaluation of the anti-Semite. Quote, "How can anyone choose to reason falsely? It is simply the old yearning for impermeability. There are people who are attracted by the permanence of stone. They would like to be solid and impenetrable. They don't want change, for who knows what change will bring. They do not wish to acquire ideals or ideas. Nothing is sought except that which has already been found, and they perceive as serving them well." End of quote. In simple terms, there are those who choose not to choose, or are rendered incapable of doing so. For to employ the choice and the option of choice shatters everything that maintains one's static position as it is, the one that too often people will hold onto for dear life and not accept any other thinking that would shake it or require them to look inside themselves, to engage with their own conscience. Don't confuse me with the facts. My mind is made up. For Nechama Leibowitz, in following the direct trajectory of the narrative, this is more of a negotiation between God and Pharaoh. As she explains the phrase, "Va'ani aksheh et lev Paro," I will harden, or I will make kasheh, Pharaoh's heart, she notes that God shares this with Moshe in chapter 7, verse 3, among other places, supporting Moshe by indicating that God has more signs and wonders that will outrun any stasis in Pharaoh's position, whether or not we want to accept Zornberg's reading. Leibowitz enumerates the use of the verbs indicated above copious times throughout this parsha, which leaves us with this question. If God is calling the shots, then how can we speak of addictions? Just as how can we speak of free choice? This would, in our case here, be the fault of the person. It would not be the fault of the person who suffers from such stasis, right? Many of our traditional commentaries make this easy for us. God is always intervening, and everything that happens is according to God's plan. But wait, that's too simple, because we have now taken free choice off the table. It is the proverbial problem of finally fixing one corner of the rug in the room, but another one pops up, and we are back to where we started, needing to figure all of this out in a way that works on all sides of the ultimate equation of the different factors included. Nechama actually explains that what we need to understand is that God's supervision does not operate on the same plane as our choice, and that our choice is not removed by God's intervention. Rather, we are dealing with two parallel planes, which may seem correlative, but Nechama indicates are not causative. Even the use of the various verbs indicate that Pharaoh was given choices and did not take them, bringing us back to Zornberg's reading. The whole scenario is of particular interest when we consider who the speaker and the adversary is in the scenario, none other than Moshe Rabbeinu. He is not the most likely choice, given his own self-perception, to be the leader, as we read in last week's Parsha. But Moshe says to God, "I have never been a man of words. Adonai, lo ish devarim anochi." Not in the past have you spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. And God says to him, who do you think gives man speech? Who makes the individual dumb or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I? Now go, and I will be with you, and I will instruct you what to say. But he pleads yet again, and he says, I am God. I will be with you. I will be your mouth. I will make someone else your agent. God becomes angry with Moshe and says, here's your brother Aaron. He speaks well. He will be happy to help you. Further, we see a bit later in the text of this week's reading, as it opens up, that Moshe is encouraged to look outside of himself, to choose to acknowledge that he is never meant to do it all by himself. We read, and God spoke to Moshe and says, I am the Lord your God. Ve'era el Abraham, el Yitzhak, ve'el Yaakov. I have appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, and I will appear to you. And even goes one step further and says, I will appear to you in a way that is more intimate, that is even more supportive, that is more intense than I did with them. Because I hear the moans, I see the situation, and I know what is needed. I will take all of you, as a nation. I will be a God to you. And I do want you all to remember this piece, because in 2 weeks, we're going to focus in Beshalach on when the Jews seem united and are referred to as Am Yisrael versus when they are referred to as Bnei Yisrael. A group of individuals that have different needs and competing ideas and what have you, versus when we come together as a united collective. Here we are talking about the united collective. And I will bring you to the land. Moshe then goes, Vaydaber Moshe Cain al Bnei Yisrael, and spoke to the children of Israel, but they don't listen to him. So they're using their choice from their perspective. Now, there are reasons given for them not being able to attend to what Moshe is saying or to believe the vision of what is to come, because they are mired in the present situation. Now Moshe is told, go speak to Pharaoh. And then what does Moshe say in verse 12? Vayidaber Moshe lifnei Hashem lemor, hen b'nei Yisrael lo shamu elai ve'ech yishame'enu paro va'ani arel sfatayim. The children of Israel didn't listen to me. B'nei Yisrael here is used, the plural. Lo shamu. Here I am. How's Pharaoh going to listen to me? Seeing that I am of closed lips, that I can't speak, that I am not articulate enough. So think about this. Let's look at where everybody is here in this situation. There are those who become addicted to the perceived limitations of physical or other challenges. This is indeed a very human reaction. But as we say, faith in God, with that faith in God, look at what can happen as the narrative unfolds. The condition does not change. It is Moshe's reaction that will change. Ultimately, it is fueled by something much greater than his own resources that will transcend his being. And he will choose to go way out of his comfort zone to his courage zone based on that. Moshe listens to God. Moshe has faith in God, if not as much so in himself. Moshe chooses to look outside of himself at the bigger picture for answers to the challenges he's confronting. Moshe will have to use this element of choice to overcome his own hesitation, given his knowledge of self and self-awareness of his limitations. God will encourage him by explaining that he can use his choice to do good, and ultimately he will do exactly that. The Sfat Emet suggests that he cannot speak because he intuits that people do not hear him. In other words, there's potentially a clash of the use of choice here. Choice to overcome limitations, in Moshe's case, choice to become addicted to limitations, which we see in Pharaoh's situation, and choice to become addicted to the perceived hopelessness of situations, in the case of the Bnei Yisrael. Choice to see oneself as one wishes, with no regard to others, as Pharaoh. There are so many different ways to go here. Acknowledging that one can become blinded by these conflicting choices and ramifications, Zornberg speaks of the corrosive moral challenge, which here is reflected by the question, what have we done? What have you done to us? Why are you in conflict with me? And so on and so forth. By focusing on the self and seeing this egocentric view of the events that unfold, one is never able to respond to the entire picture. Pharaoh sees this as himself, does not see himself as part of a larger picture. Moshe rises above it, accepts God's grander view, and moves outside of his comfort zone. The Bnei Yisrael are caught in this situation and are having a difficulty moving on. When one is precluded from developing a sense of empathy for any perspective except one's own, that is being addicted. That is what we mean when we say, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened. This is understandable to us as we are aware indeed of the various perceptions that go into the collective telling of a shared experience. It can be, and clearly is, overwhelming. Further, we are looking at the various influences on our behaviors, both from internal sources, as in the case of addictions, and external sources, when one can rise above one's perceived limitations and believes in God. Think of the first 3 steps of the well-known faith-based 12-step program. Gamblers go through it, alcoholics go through it, sex addicts go through it, drug addicts go through it. 1, admitting that one is powerless over what they are addicted to. 2, acknowledgement that there is a higher power. 3, turn oneself over to that higher power for recalibration, so to speak. When one cannot admit that there is something outside of self and is so addicted to the power of their own perceived hubris, there is no hope for effectively using conscience-based, intentional, free choice. Rabbi Avraham Twersky, a noted authority on addicted behavior, explains to us, quote, "It is clearly that such dependency is worrisome from a Torah perspective. The ideal of human freedom from bondage is the central motif of the entire Torah. The Torah's central narrative is of God freeing the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt. Scores of commandments are described as commemorations of the slavery itself or of the liberation, or else as lessons learned from the experience as slaves. While the Torah does recognize the phenomenon of slavery, it makes clear that servitude is a base status that a person must avoid. An indentured servant, for example, who agrees to extend his servitude beyond the indentured period must have his ear pierced or bored as a symbol, according to Shemot, Exodus chapter 21, verse 6. The Talmud tells us that this is meant as a visible sign of 1, a person who did not value his freedom, and 2, one who chose to do so or to not do so. You put the awl or the pierced into the ear which heard on Mount Sinai. And that is what has rejected the freedom. In other words, to bring together Nechama and Aviva's perspectives by following God and being attentive to God's plan for us, we come to understand that free choice, Bechira Chavshit, is both a privilege and a responsibility. Moshe had his doubts, but in turning to God found the strength to choose to go from his comfort zone to his courage zone and truly become Moshe Rabbeinu. With so many opportunities to consider his role, he looks outside of himself to his higher power, to Ribbonu Shel Olam, and acts accordingly. As Nechama teaches, one must look outside of oneself to see the signs and wonders that God places before us. On the other end of the spectrum, Pharaoh could not and or lost his ability to look beyond his self and the perceived power he wielded, with results that seemed to feed his own hubris, leading him to the addiction to that hubris. He was addicted to his own perception of self-importance, leading to his downfall. I think that here we have two personality models that are highly instructive in what can happen depending on which path we choose in our own lives in responding to those elements of our being that we may think define us. We certainly see this in our lives today with leaders in various positions who do not consult with others, do not think in a consciously intentional manner regarding why did this happen to me or why do you argue with me? As in the case of Zornberg's corrosive moral challenge and the often horrific results that ensue. Rather, if we, like Moshe, learn to consult with others, as Yitro will teach in the coming weeks, think of others as we see in these Parshiot and understand that we are not the center of the universe, that leaders are to serve and not be served, only then do we have any hope of healing the many fractures and fissures that mar our world today. I will end by sharing why I love learning from these amazing teachers, these women. Tamar Ross, in her wonderful book, Expanding the Palace of Torah, teaches that women are more comfortable in seeing nuances, are willing to look under the surface for additional meanings, and live in the resulting world of gray matter that may surface. More so than men in too many cases. Now, granted, this is a generalization. This is not an absolute statement. I'm the one who teaches about many genders and that we are not dichotomous. But what she's saying definitely is worth attending to. This is not a matter of finding the answer that squares off all of the hanging questions. We are not going to fix the rug in the room completely, but rather accepting the Venn diagram of conflicting and separate notions that come together in some, not necessarily neat and clear way in our narrative. We know this to be the case in our own lives. We know that the cause and effect dynamic is more often unresolved and may leave us with more questions than answers. So it is with human behavior. When we think of the magnitude of this story, which frames the most celebrated and observed Jewish experience of the entire collective of the Jewish nation and tells how we actually became a nation, I would suggest that for purposes of whatever degree of accuracy we can achieve, we should remember that we do not and will never know the entire story. And that for the magnitude of people involved, the range of experiences is just too wide for us to imagine. So let us think about the two ideas presented here as just one very small part of the larger landscape. The part that addictions play in our lives if we are not careful, which might be a lesson from Pharaoh. And being careful and intentional in protecting our ability to choose while looking beyond ourselves to find inspiration to do so, as in the case with Moshe Rabbeinu. May we all learn to be the ones that accept our limitations, that are realistic, that look with empathy at the larger picture, and do not become addicted to ourselves. Shabbat Shalom.